about it in a larger scale. He says it's not a gun situation. What do you make of that response? What are we hearing from lawmakers on Capitol Hill in response to it?
Well, that's generally sort of the response we've been hearing from Republicans after these mass shootings. It's less about gun control and more about mental health and dealing with that issue. You hear that pretty consistently from Republicans. On the Hill, you're hearing, again, Republicans basically offer their thoughts and prayers and saying it's a devastating event, and Democrats immediately calling for more gun control. In fact, some, like Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who, if you remember, was the congressman who represented Sandy Hook back in 2012 when that massacre happened up there, he has really used this, again, he's using these events, these mass shootings, as a call for serious gun control. He did it again yesterday. But Democrats, again, using it as a platform to call for more gun control.
So, Steve, what about the state of the larger debate about gun control in this country? You know, in the wake of the Las Vegas shooting, we heard all about these bump stocks, these devices that turn a semi-automatic weapon essentially into an automatic weapon. And then it seemed like things sort of simmered down. I know Massachusetts just passed a law banning bump stocks, and there had been some bipartisan legislation that was introduced at the national level. But where do things stand?
Well, it's a standstill, basically. It's frozen. And I mean, this is where it's been after every one of these massacres. And it's really interesting to watch because you hear a lot of talk after all of this stuff. Let's go back to Sandy Hook as an example. When you had a Democratic president and Democratic Congress, and there was talk about new gun controls, and Congress couldn't get anything through even after that, when all those children were killed in Connecticut. In Las Vegas just recently, you had the largest mass shooting in American history, and the one idea that they all came up with was this bump stock legislation, which would have really ban a specific part to be attached to semi-automatic weapons to make them act like an automatic weapon. And again, that's frozen. You have the NRA, you have Republican leaders in Congress saying, well, really, this is up to the ATF to deal with. This is not really, doesn't need any legislation. And you have Democrats who are saying, no, well, we've got to have more gun control. So it's, with Republicans leading Congress, it's frozen on Capitol Hill. Nothing's happening. Again, yet another big gun shooting that results in no action from Congress.
Steve, let's talk about the foreign policy front. We know the president has been pushing allies to do more on North Korea during this trip. There seems to be a two-pronged approach to this trip. One is in dealing with the North Korea issue. The other is one of the president's favorite topics, trade. So whilst he was in Japan, he and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, they signed some baseball caps, they played a little golf, they had some fun together. But every time the president seemed to talk about trade or bring up the issue of trade, Prime Minister Abe ducked the issue. So I'm wondering, just from an optics perspective and from a real foreign policy perspective, if the optics are such that the Prime Minister of Japan says, look, Donald Trump may be popular with his base in the United States, but here we've got other considerations that we have to keep in mind, and we're not going to come to the table on trade with him. How does that play in D.C.?
Well, we'll see. I mean, this is something the president talked about all throughout the campaign. He's been talking about it since he became president, and now he's trying to put it into action, trying to renegotiate these trade deals with Japan, with South Korea, with China, and other countries that he's not visiting. And we'll see what happens there. What's interesting about his relationship with Abe is that they actually have a really good sort of personal relationship, and I think that has shown itself in their discussions about North Korea. You've seen the Prime Minister basically agreeing with the President, taking a hard line against North Korea. The Prime Minister said they're going to issue new sanctions against North Korea. The Prime Minister said that they're going to put more pressure on North Korea. There's talk about military pressure, and they're really in agreement on that. Where the President has a challenge is now he's going to South Korea, and he needs to talk to the leaders there about dealing with North Korea. They are more interested in diplomacy and less about this military might. So it's going to be interesting to see how that conversation goes on top of the trade conversation he's going to have with South Korea.
And then after that, off to China, similar conversation, you know, what to do about North Korea. And the administration has been, while both praising China for cracking down and stopping some of the sales of coal and stuff like that, also encouraging or prodding China to do more. You know, what's going to be the focus in China? How is the president going to sort of win them over?
going to try to twist their arm on
Yeah.
this and basically say this is coming to a head at this point, and China is the closest in terms of conversing with North Korea and working with North Korea, and he's going to put a ton of pressure on them to tell North Korea to back off on nukes. And it's going to be really interesting to see what China does, because there's been a lot of talk from afar, President Trump and Xi in China. We'll see what happens in person if China actually listens to this or not. But this is something that we're all watching very, very closely as this comes to a head in North Korea.
Steve, the president also said he expects to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. What are you going to be watching for, I should say, out of a possible meeting between those two?
Well, let's keep in mind, this isn't the first time they will have met in person since Trump has become president. You remember back over the summer at the G20 meeting, there were a couple of meetings. And so I don't think we're going to get a real sense of exactly what they're talking about. But what I'm going to be watching for is, if you remember what happened over the summer, the meetings were quite controversial in how they were set up and the diplomacy involved, and whether the State Department was actually involved. And then it came out later that the president had an hour-long meeting with him, but there was not a U.S. translator there. I'm interested to see what the logistics are behind the meetings. Is this going to be more of a standard meeting between the two, or is it going to be a pull-aside where Putin has or seems to have the upper hand, like what happened at the G20? That's the thing I'm going to be looking for. What kind of controversy, if any, is going to happen between the two, and how they actually sit down and talk to each other if this happens.
I hope that the press is allowed into that meeting. Certainly the translators are there. I don't think we want a repeat of that.
Yeah, right. Translators on both sides.
On both sides.
Right. So before we let you go, Steve, got to ask you about these so-called Paradise Papers. They're a collection of documents exposing offshore tax secrets. So the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, has got himself all caught up in this. There's some information that revealed that Wilbur Ross and Putin's son-in-law have a common investment in a shipping company. Tell us about these revelations and what the possible impact could be.
Well, so it turns out that Ross invested some money in a company that, as you mentioned, Putin's son-in-law runs. The Commerce Secretary is basically saying, look, this investment happened, first of all, before, basically, there's nothing untoward on this. He said that basically this is an investment he doesn't really know much about, and it's not something that he did because of the Russian connection, and it's a publicly traded company, was part of his response to this. But where this becomes a problem for Ross is Congress sees this as yet another example of somebody in the Trump orbit not being fully transparent with Congress when asked about connections to Russia. If you remember, Ross, during his confirmation hearing, failed or said he did not have any connections to Russia. And so there are Democrats accusing the Commerce Secretary of failing to disclose this and suggesting it was intentional. And now they want to drag him before Congress again and ask him questions about this. They're saying there's too many people, they say, that have not told Congress everything they know about their connections to Russia.
I suspect it's difficult so part of the appeal for those supporters of President Trump was the outsider status, the idea of bringing in some businessmen who are not swamp folks in D.C. Who are really smart and know how to run things. Part of the challenge, obviously, as we're seeing right now, and I'm not talking about Jeff Sessions, but I'm talking about folks like Wilbur Ross or Gary Cohn, is that you're talking about these businessmen with hundreds of different business interests over the course of their careers, and giving them the benefit of the doubt, it may be difficult for them to recall every single deal that they've ever been involved in. And
on top of that, these things may be totally legal as well, and that's what Ross is arguing. Like, this is not something that is illegal, at least in his mind. There's nothing untoward about this, so it didn't rise to the level of him feeling like he needed to disclose. Now, as we all know who've been covering this issue, anything that has Russia connected to it is a controversial issue. Now, whether it's legal or not, it's another story. But you figure that people would want to err on the side of just sort of laying it all out there. And I think time and again we're seeing that people in the Trump orbit did not lay it all out there. And every time we discover one of these things, questions are raised, eyebrows are raised, and it raises a lot of political issues, especially among Democrats and critics of the president, to suggest that maybe these guys were hiding something, even though maybe they weren't. But that's the suggestion from Democrats.
Yeah, time to call up your financial advisor and find out exactly
what do you own.
What do you own? Yeah,
you just find out that rich people. You just find out that rich people are just like regular Americans. When they get a statement, they're just like, yeah, okay, and they put it in the drawer, and they don't look at what's on it.
Right, kind of like regular Americans.
Yeah,
kind of.
Probably a little bit more money involved.
Yeah, a little bit. Steve Chaggaris in Washington. Thank you.